in the forgotten corners of the American frontier, where dust settles on broken dreams and hope seems as scarce as water in the desert, sometimes salvation comes from the most unexpected places. This is the story of Mary, a young woman whose life was about to change forever in the small town of Willow Creek, where the sound of spurs on wooden floors echoed through saloon doors, and where a single act of kindness could rewrite destiny itself. But before we begin, leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and tell us where you're listening from. The autumn wind carried the scent of dying leaves and would smoke through the dusty streets of Willow Creek, a town that time seemed to have forgotten somewhere between the Rocky Mountains and the endless prairie. The year was 1887, and life moved at the pace of horse hooves and the rhythm of hammers on anvils. Mary Collins sat on the splintered steps of the general store, her worn cotton dress pulled tight around her thin frame, watching the world pass by with eyes that had seen too much for her 22 years. She had been in Willow Creek for 3 months now, ever since the consumption had claimed her aunt, the last family member who had grudgingly taken her in. With no relatives left and no dowry to speak of, Mary found herself in that precarious position that befell too many women on the frontier, completely alone and utterly dependent on the charity of strangers. The town's charity, however, had worn thin. Mrs. Henderson at the boarding house had made it clear that Mary's welcome would expire with the week. "I run a business, not a charity house," she had said that morning, her voice sharp as winter air. "Find yourself a husband, or find yourself another town." As the afternoon sun cast long shadows across Main Street, Mary watched the familiar figures of Willow Creek go about their daily routines. Old Pete swept the front of his barber shop, occasionally spitting tobacco juice into the dust. The blacksmith's hammer rang out its steady rhythm, and somewhere in the distance, cattle lowed in the holding pens near the railroad tracks. It was then that she noticed Jake Morrison stumbling out of the Silver Dollar Saloon, a half-empty bottle of whiskey clutched in his weathered hand. Jake was a familiar sight in Willow Creek, a man who had once owned a small ranch until drink and poor decisions had cost him everything. Now he worked odd jobs when he could find them, and spent his earnings on the liquid comfort that kept his demons at bay. Mary tried to make herself smaller as Jake's bloodshot eyes focused on her, but there was nowhere to hide on the open street. He approached with the swaggering confidence that only whiskey could provide, his boots scraping against the wooden planks of the boardwalk. "Well, well," Jake slurred, his voice carrying the weight of too many mornings after. "If it ain't little Mary Collins, sitting all alone like a lost lamb." Mary stood up, instinctively backing toward the store's entrance, but Jake moved to block her path. The few townspeople on the street seemed to suddenly find urgent business elsewhere, their footsteps quickening as they sensed trouble brewing. "I heard about your situation," Jake continued, taking a swig from his bottle. "Heard Mrs. Henderson's fixin' to turn you out. That's a shame, real shame. Pretty little thing like you shouldn't be wandering the streets with nowhere to go." "I'll find something," Mary said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. She had learned long ago that speaking softly sometimes made men lose interest, but Jake wasn't in a mood to be deterred. "Now, I got a proposition for you," Jake said, his eyes gleaming with a mixture of alcohol and something darker. "I know a place, couple towns over, where a girl like you could make real good money. All you gotta do is be friendly. Real friendly." Mary's stomach turned. She had heard whispers about such places, about women who disappeared into them and were never seen again. "No," she said more firmly this time. "I won't do that." Jake's expression darkened. "You think you're too good for honest work? You think you got choices." He laughed, a bitter sound that made Mary's skin crawl. "Let me tell you something, little girl. You got no family, no money, no prospects. You're nobody." The words hit Mary like physical blows. She had thought the same things herself during the long, sleepless nights at the boarding house, but hearing them spoken aloud made them somehow more real, more devastating. "Tell you what," Jake said, his voice taking on a mock-reasonable tone. "I'll make you a deal. You come with me right now, and I'll give you this here bottle of whiskey. Fair trade, don't you think? 1 bottle for 1 girl." Mary felt the blood drain from her face. You're trying to buy me?" "Buy? Nah, that's too strong a word. Let's say I'm making you an offer, a business proposition. Jake took another drink, then wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. Come on, what's it gonna be? You can stand here and starve, or you can come with old Jake and at least have a roof over your head. Mary looked around desperately, hoping anyone, would intervene. But the street had emptied, and those few people who remained studiously avoided looking in her direction. In that moment, she felt smaller than she ever had in her life, as if she were indeed nothing more than a commodity to be bartered away. I said no, Mary repeated, but her voice shook with fear and exhaustion. Jake's patience was wearing thin. Don't be stupid, girl. You got no choice here. Either you come with me, or you'll be begging in the streets come winter. And trust me, begging in a Colorado winter ain't gonna keep you alive. He reached out to grab her arm, and Mary flinched away, but there was nowhere to go. Jake's fingers closed around her wrist with surprising strength for a man so drunk, and Mary felt panic rising in her chest like floodwater. Let go of me, she whispered, then louder. Let go of me. Now you listen here, Jake began, but he was interrupted by a voice from behind him. I believe the lady asked you to let her go. Both Mary and Jake turned to see a tall man standing in the street, his shadow stretching long across the dusty ground. He was perhaps in his mid-30s, with dark hair and weathered features that spoke of years spent under the prairie sun. His clothes were simple but well-made, a brown leather vest over a white shirt, dark trousers, and boots that had seen honest work. Most notably, he carried himself with the quiet confidence of a man who had no need to prove his strength with loud words or aggressive gestures. Mary had seen him before in town, though always at a distance. The townspeople called him the Silent One from the Hill, Elijah Gray, who owned a ranch a few miles outside of Willow Creek. He rarely came to town, and when he did, he conducted his business quietly and efficiently before disappearing back into the countryside. Jake, however, was too drunk and too angry to be intimidated by quiet confidence. This ain't your concern, Gray, he snarled, tightening his grip on Mary's wrist. The girl and I are just having a friendly conversation. Doesn't look friendly to me, Elijah replied, his voice calm but carrying an undertone of steel. He took a step closer, and Mary noticed that his hand rested casually near the gun at his hip, not threateningly, but ready. You think you can just waltz in here and play hero? Jake's voice was rising, drawing attention from the few brave souls who had remained on the street. This girl's got no family, no money, no prospects. She needs someone to take care of her, and I'm offering by offering to trade her for a bottle of whiskey. Elijah's voice remained steady, but Mary could see the anger in his eyes. That's not taking care of someone, Morrison. That's buying a slave. The word hung in the air like a challenge. Jake's face flushed red, and for a moment, Mary was certain he was going to draw his gun. But something in Elijah's steady gaze seemed to deflate his anger, replacing it with the sullen resentment of a man who knew he was in the wrong but was too proud to admit it. Fine, Jake said, releasing Mary's wrist so abruptly that she stumbled. But don't come crying to me when you're sleeping in the street come winter. Some people can't be helped. He turned and stalked back toward the saloon, muttering curses under his breath. Mary rubbed her wrist where his fingers had left red marks, trying to process what had just happened. Elijah watched Jake disappear into the saloon before turning his attention to Mary. Up close, she could see the lines around his eyes that spoke of years of squinting against the sun, and the calluses on his hands that told of honest work. But it was his eyes that caught her attention. They were kind, but sad, as if he carried his own share of sorrows. Are you hurt? He asked gently. Mary shook her head, though her wrist throbbed where Jake had grabbed her. No, I thank you. You didn't have to do that. Yes, I did, Elijah replied simply. Nobody should be treated like that. Nobody. They stood in awkward silence for a moment, the weight of the situation settling between them. Mary wanted to thank him properly, to express her gratitude for his intervention, but the words seemed inadequate, and underneath her relief was the crushing knowledge that Jake had been right about one thing. She truly had nowhere to go. I heard what he said, Elijah continued, his voice gentle, about your situation. Is it true? Mary felt her cheeks burn with shame. Yes. Mrs. Henderson says I have until the end of the week to find somewhere else. Elijah nodded slowly, as if considering something. And you have no family? No prospects? No, Mary whispered. I have nothing. For a long moment, Elijah was silent, his eyes studying her face with an intensity that made Mary want to look away. But there was nothing predatory in his gaze, only a deep thoughtfulness, as if he were wrestling with some internal decision. Finally, he spoke. I have a proposition for you, Miss Collins. A real proposition, not like what Morrison was offering. Mary's heart began to race. She had heard enough propositions for one day, and while Elijah seemed different from Jake, she had learned not to trust easily. What kind of proposition? She asked carefully. I have a ranch about 5 miles north of town. It's not much, just a small spread with some cattle and a few horses. But I have a cabin there, and I could use someone to help with the cooking and cleaning. In exchange, you'd have a roof over your head, 3 meals a day, and a small wage. Mary stared at him, certain she had misheard. You're offering me a job? I'm offering you a chance, Elijah corrected. A chance to start over, to make something of yourself. No strings attached, no hidden expectations. Just honest work for honest pay. But you don't know me, Mary said, bewildered. You don't know anything about me. I know enough, Elijah replied. I know you're in trouble through no fault of your own. I know you stood up to Morrison even when you were scared. And I know you deserve better than what this town has given you. Mary felt tears prick at her eyes. It had been so long since anyone had spoken to her with such basic human kindness that she had almost forgotten what it felt like. Why, she asked. Why would you help me? Elijah was quiet for a long moment, his gaze distant. Let's just say I know what it's like to be alone, he said finally. And I believe everyone deserves a second chance. Mary looked into his eyes and saw something there that she recognized, a deep loneliness, a sadness that mirrored her own. Whatever his reasons, his offer seemed genuine, and it was certainly better than anything else she had been offered. I accept, she said quietly. Elijah nodded. Good. Can you be ready to leave in an hour? I'd like to get back to the ranch before dark. I don't have much to pack, Mary admitted. Just a few clothes and my mother's Bible. That's fine. We can get you anything else you need. Elijah tipped his hat slightly. I'll meet you at the boarding house in an hour. As he walked away, Mary watched him go with a mixture of hope and trepidation. She had no idea what lay ahead, but for the first time in months, she felt something she had almost forgotten, the possibility of a future that didn't end in despair. An hour later, Mary stood on the front porch of the boarding house with her few possessions packed in a worn carpet bag that had belonged to her aunt. The bag contained 2 dresses, a change of undergarments, a pair of worn boots, and her mother's leather-bound Bible, the only thing she had left of her family. Mrs. Henderson stood in the doorway behind her, arms crossed and lips pursed in disapproval. I still think you're making a mistake, girl, she said for the 3rd time. Running off to live with a man you barely know. People will talk. People are already talking, Mary replied quietly. At least this way. I'll have a roof over my head while they do it. Mrs. Henderson sniffed disdainfully. Mark my words, no good will come of this. Men like Elijah Gray don't help women out of the goodness of their hearts. They always want something in return. Mary wanted to argue, to defend Elijah's kindness, but the truth was that she barely knew him. All she had to go on was the way he had stood up to Jake Morrison and the genuine concern she had seen in his eyes. It wasn't much, but it was more than anyone else had offered her. The sound of horse hooves on the street announced Elijah's arrival. Mary looked up to see him approaching in a sturdy wagon pulled by 2 bay horses. He had changed into traveling clothes, a dark coat, and hat that spoke of a man prepared for the weather. When he saw her waiting, he climbed down from the wagon and approached with that same quiet confidence she had noticed earlier. Miss Collins, he said, tipping his hat. Are you ready? Yes, Mary replied, though her voice betrayed her nervousness. Elijah took her carpet bag and placed it gently in the back of the wagon, then offered his hand to help her up onto the seat. His touch was brief and respectful, and Mary found herself grateful for his obvious effort to put her at ease. "Mrs. Henderson," Elijah nodded politely to the boarding house keeper. "Thank you for taking care of Miss Collins." Mrs. Henderson's expression softened slightly at his courtesy, but her disapproval remained. "You just make sure you treat her proper, Elijah Gray. That girl's been through enough." "Yes, ma'am," Elijah replied simply. "I intend to." As they drove away from the boarding house, Mary took one last look at Willow Creek. The town had never felt like home, but it had been all she had known for the past 3 months. Now she was heading into the unknown with a man who was little more than a stranger, and she felt a mixture of fear and anticipation that made her stomach flutter. The wagon rolled through the center of town, past the general store, where she had spent so many hours sitting on the steps, past the Silver Dollar Saloon, where Jake Morrison was no doubt drowning his anger in whiskey. A few people stopped to stare as they passed, and Mary could almost hear the whispers that would follow. "There goes Mary Collins, running off with the silent man from the hill." Once they left the town behind, the landscape opened up into rolling hills covered with autumn grass that rippled in the wind like waves on a golden sea. The air was crisp and clean, carrying the scent of sage and distant pine trees. Mary had rarely been outside of Willow Creek, and she found herself marveling at the vastness of the country they were traveling through. For the first mile, they rode in silence, the only sounds the creak of the wagon wheels and the steady clip-clop of the horses' hooves. Mary stole glances at Elijah, trying to read his expression, but his face remained impassive as he guided the horses along the well-worn trail. Finally, she worked up the courage to speak. "How long have you lived at the ranch?" "About 8 years, Elijah replied. "I came out here after the war, looking for somewhere quiet to settle down." "The war?" Mary asked, though she suspected she knew which war he meant. "The Civil War," Elijah confirmed. "I served with the Colorado Volunteers. When it was over, I didn't much feel like going back to where I came from." Mary nodded, understanding more than she could say. The war had touched everyone in some way, leaving scars that weren't always visible. She had been just a child when it ended, but she had seen the hollow look in the eyes of men who had returned from the fighting, and she recognized the shadow of that same look in Elijah's eyes. "Where did you come from?" she asked gently. "Missouri," Elijah said. "Had a farm there with my wife, but that was a long time ago." The way he said wife made Mary's heart skip. "Is she?" "She died," Elijah said simply. "Fever took her while I was away fighting. By the time I got word and made it home, she'd been in the ground for 2 months." "I'm sorry," Mary said, and meant it. She could hear the pain in his voice, even though he tried to hide it. "Like I said, that was a long time ago," Elijah replied. "I came out here to start fresh, and I've been on my own ever since." They rode in silence for a while longer, each lost in their own thoughts. Mary found herself wondering what Elijah's wife had been like, and whether she was stepping into a situation that would always be haunted by the memory of another woman. But there was something in Elijah's manner that told her he wouldn't have offered her this opportunity if he weren't ready for it. The sun was beginning to sink toward the western horizon when they crested a hill, and Mary got her first glimpse of Gray Ranch. It was indeed a small spread, as Elijah had said, a modest wooden house with a wide front porch, a barn, a corral with several horses, and pastures where cattle grazed peacefully. Smoke rose from the chimney, and the whole scene had a peaceful, welcoming quality that made Mary's heart lift. "It's beautiful," she said, and meant it. Elijah looked at her with surprise, as if he hadn't expected her to appreciate the simple beauty of the place. "It's not much," he said, "but it's honest work and clean living." "It's more than I've had in a long time," Mary replied. As they approached the house, Mary noticed how well-maintained everything was. The fence posts were straight and strong, the barn was in good repair, and the house itself, while simple, was clearly built to last. It spoke of a man who took pride in his work and believed in doing things right. Elijah pulled the wagon up to the front porch and climbed down, then came around to help Mary down. As her feet touched the ground, she felt a moment of panic. What if she couldn't do the job? What if she disappointed him? What if this was all a mistake? But Elijah seemed to sense her nervousness. "Don't worry," he said gently. "We'll take it one day at a time. No pressure, no expectations beyond honest work." He picked up her carpet bag and led her toward the house. "I should warn you," he said as they climbed the front steps. "I'm not much for conversation. I've gotten used to the quiet out here. But don't take it personal if I don't say much." "I understand," Mary said. "I'm used to quiet too." Elijah opened the front door and stepped aside to let her enter first. The interior of the house was simple but comfortable, with a large main room that served as both living area and kitchen. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, and the furniture, while sparse, was well-made and sturdy. Everything was clean and orderly, but there was something indefinably lonely about the space, as if it were waiting for life to return to it. "This is the main room," Elijah said, setting her bag down by the door. "Kitchen's over there, and there's a pantry with supplies. My room is upstairs, and there's a small room off the kitchen that you can use. It's not much, but it's private and warm." He led her to a small room that contained a narrow bed, a wooden chest, and a small window that looked out over the pastures. It was simple, but it was more than Mary had dared hope for, a room of her own, with a bed and a view of the endless sky. "It's perfect," she said, and she meant it. Elijah nodded. "I'll let you get settled in. There's firewood by the hearth, and I'll bring in some water from the well. We usually eat supper around 6, if that's all right with you." "Of course," Mary said. "What would you like me to cook?" "Whatever you're comfortable with," Elijah replied. "There's beef in the smokehouse, vegetables from the garden, and plenty of staples in the pantry. I'm not particular." After he left, Mary sat on the edge of the bed and looked around her new home. It was strange to think that just a few hours ago, she had been sitting on the steps of the general store with nowhere to go and no prospects. Now she had a roof over her head, a job to do, and a chance to start over. She opened her carpet bag and began to unpack her few belongings. As she placed her mother's Bible on the wooden chest, she whispered a prayer of gratitude for the unexpected kindness of a stranger. She didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in months, she felt hope stirring in her chest. Outside, she could hear Elijah moving around, tending to the horses and checking on the cattle. The sounds were peaceful and reassuring, speaking of a life built on honest work and simple pleasures. Mary smoothed her dress and prepared to begin her new life, determined to prove herself worthy of the chance she had been given. The first few weeks at Gray Ranch established a rhythm that Mary found both comforting and challenging. She rose before dawn to start the fire and prepare breakfast, spent her days cleaning, cooking, and tending to the small vegetable garden behind the house, and fell into bed each night exhausted, but with a sense of accomplishment she had never known before. Elijah had been true to his word. He was a man of few words, but his silence wasn't unfriendly. He would nod his approval when she set his breakfast before him, comment briefly on the weather or the condition of the cattle, and thank her politely for her efforts. In the evenings, he would sit by the fire reading or mending tack, while Mary worked on her sewing or read from her mother's Bible. It was a peaceful existence, but Mary found herself longing for more connection with the man who had saved her from Jake Morrison's proposition. She sensed depths in Elijah that he kept carefully hidden, and she wondered if he was as lonely as she had been in those desperate days in Willow Creek. One evening in early November, as the first snow of the season dusted the hills around the ranch, Mary was preparing supper when she heard the unmistakable sound of a horse approaching at a gallop. She looked out the window to see a young man she didn't recognize riding hard toward the house, his mount lathered with sweat. Elijah emerged from the barn and intercepted the rider in the yard. Mary could see them talking urgently, and when Elijah's shoulders tensed, she knew something was wrong. A moment later, he was striding toward the house with the grim expression of a man bearing bad news. "Mary," he called as he entered, "I need to ride out to the Thompson place. Their boy Jimmy took a bad fall, and they need help getting him to the doctor in town." Mary had met the Thompsons briefly at the general store. They were a young couple with 3 small children who had a hardscrabble farm about 10 miles south. Jimmy was their oldest, a boy of perhaps 12, who helped his father with the heavy work. "How bad is it?" Mary asked. "Bad enough," Elijah replied grimly. Tom thinks his leg might be broken, and they don't have a wagon to get him to town. I'm going to take our wagon and drive them in." "I'll come with you," Mary said immediately. Elijah shook his head. "No need. I can handle it." "A hurt child needs a woman's touch," Mary insisted. "I can help keep him comfortable during the ride, and Mrs. Thompson will need someone to look after the younger children." For a moment, Elijah looked as if he might argue, but then he nodded. "All right, but we need to leave now. Every minute counts." They hitched the horses to the wagon as quickly as possible, and Mary grabbed her medical supplies, a small kit of bandages, laudanum, and other necessities that any frontier woman kept on hand. As they raced across the darkening countryside, Mary found herself praying for the Thompson boy, and for the strength to help however she could. The Thompson farm was a modest affair, little more than a log cabin and a small barn surrounded by fields that spoke of backbreaking work for minimal return. As they pulled up to the house, Mary could hear the sound of a child crying inside, and her heart clenched with sympathy. Tom Thompson met them at the door, his face drawn with worry. "Thank God you came," he said to Elijah. "Jimmy's in bad shape, and Sarah's beside herself." Inside, Mary found a scene of controlled chaos. Jimmy lay on the kitchen table, his face pale with pain, and his left leg bent at an unnatural angle. His mother, Sarah, hovered beside him, tears streaming down her face as she tried to comfort him. The two younger children, a girl of about 8 and a boy of perhaps 5, huddled in the corner, their eyes wide with fear. "Mrs. Thompson," Mary said gently, moving to Sarah's side. "I'm Mary Collins. I work for Mr. Gray now. Let me help." Sarah looked up at her with desperate gratitude. "Oh, Mary, thank goodness. I don't know what to do." He was helping Tom repair the barn roof when the ladder slipped, and he fell so hard. Mary knelt beside the boy, her hands gentle as she examined his injury. The leg was definitely broken, and from the way Jimmy was breathing, she suspected he might have other injuries as well. But first, she needed to calm him and manage his pain. "Jimmy," she said softly, "I'm going to give you something to help with the pain, all right? You're going to be fine, but we need to get you to the doctor." She prepared a careful dose of laudanum and helped Jimmy drink it, then set about making him as comfortable as possible for the journey to town. Meanwhile, Elijah and Tom worked together to create a makeshift stretcher using blankets and wooden boards. "Sarah," Mary said as the men prepared to move Jimmy, "you should come with us. I'll stay here with the younger children." "No," Sarah shook her head. "I can't leave them. What if?" "I'll take good care of them," Mary assured her. "Your boy needs you more right now." It took some convincing, but finally Sarah agreed. As they loaded Jimmy into the wagon, Mary could see the gratitude in Elijah's eyes, and she realized that this was the first time she had seen him look at her as more than just a hired hand. The hours that followed were long and difficult. Mary kept the younger Thompson children fed and calm, telling them stories and assuring them that their brother would be fine. She cleaned the cabin, prepared food for when the family returned, and did her best to create a sense of normalcy in the midst of crisis. It was well past midnight when she heard the wagon returning. Mary quickly checked on the sleeping children, then stepped outside to meet the returning family. Sarah was the first to climb down from the wagon, her face exhausted but relieved. "How is he?" Mary asked. "The doctor says the leg will heal, but it'll take time," Sarah replied. "He's sleeping now, thanks to the medicine you gave him. I don't know what we would have done without you and Mr. Gray." As the men carried Jimmy inside and settled him in his bed, Mary found herself working alongside Elijah to make the family comfortable. They moved together with an efficiency that surprised her, anticipating each other's needs and actions as if they had been working as a team for years. It was nearly dawn when they finally left the Thompson farm. As they rode back toward Gray Ranch, Mary found herself sitting closer to Elijah on the wagon seat, and she noticed that he seemed less reserved than usual. "You did get back there," he said quietly. "Sarah was right. They couldn't have managed without you." "I just did what anyone would do," Mary replied. "No," Elijah said firmly. "Not everyone would have stayed calm, or known what to do, or been willing to sacrifice their own comfort for strangers. You have a gift, Mary, a gift for caring." Mary felt warmth spread through her chest at his words. It was the first time he had called her by her first name, and the way he said it made her feel like she was truly part of his life, not just an employee. "Thank you," she said softly, "for giving me the chance to help, for giving me a chance at all." Elijah was quiet for a moment, then he said, "I've been thinking about that day in town, when Morrison was bothering you. You could have given up then, could have gone with him just to survive. But you didn't. You have strength, Mary. Real strength." "I was terrified," Mary admitted. "Being brave doesn't mean you're not afraid," Elijah replied. "It means you do what's right even when you are afraid." They rode in comfortable silence for a while, watching the sun rise over the hills and paint the sky in shades of gold and pink. Mary felt something shifting between them, a deepening of their connection that went beyond employer and employee. Over the following weeks, their relationship continued to evolve. Elijah began to linger over his meals, asking Mary about her thoughts on various topics. He showed her how to care for the horses and explained the intricacies of cattle ranching. In the evenings, their conversations grew longer and more personal, as if they were both hungry for human connection after years of loneliness. Mary learned that Elijah had grown up on a farm in Missouri, that he had always dreamed of having his own land, and that he had enlisted in the army more out of duty than conviction. He spoke rarely of his first wife, but Mary sensed that her death had left him with a deep fear of loving and losing again. For her part, Mary found herself sharing stories of her childhood, of her parents' death in an influenza epidemic, and of the series of reluctant relatives who had taken her in before her aunt's death had left her truly alone. She told him about her dreams of having a real home, of belonging somewhere, and of the fear that had driven her to accept his offer. One evening in late November, as they sat by the fire after supper, Elijah surprised her by asking, "Mary, do you ever think about your future? About what you want from life?" Mary looked up from her sewing, startled by the question. "I try not to think too far ahead," she said honestly. "I've learned that life can change in an instant." "But if you could have anything," Elijah pressed, "what would it be?" Mary considered the question carefully. "I would want to belong somewhere," she said finally, "to have a place where I was wanted, not just tolerated. I would want to matter to someone." "You matter to me," Elijah said quietly. The words hung in the air between them, laden with meaning that neither of them was quite ready to acknowledge. Mary felt her heart racing as she looked into his eyes and saw something there that made her breath catch. "Elijah," she began, but he stood up abruptly. "I should check on the horses," he said, grabbing his coat. "Good night, Mary." After he left, Mary sat staring into the fire, her mind racing. Something was changing between them, something that both thrilled and terrified her. She had never dared to hope for more than a job and a roof over her head, but now she found herself wondering if perhaps there could be something more. Outside, she could hear Elijah moving around in the barn, and she wondered if he was as confused by their growing feelings as she was. They were both wounded souls, both afraid of risking their hearts again. But perhaps, Mary thought, that was exactly why they understood each other so well. As winter deepened around Gray Ranch, Mary found herself falling into a routine that felt more like a real life than anything she had experienced since her parents' death. She woke each morning with purpose, knowing that her work mattered and that she was building something meaningful with Elijah. The fear and desperation that had driven her to accept his offer had been replaced by something warmer and more hopeful. She was no longer just surviving. She was beginning to live. The harsh Colorado winter tested both Mary and Elijah in ways they hadn't expected. Blizzards trapped them in the house for days at a time, forcing them into closer quarters and more intimate conversations than either had known since their respective losses. During these long winter evenings, with the wind howling outside and the fire crackling in the hearth, they began to truly know each other. Mary learned that Elijah had been married to his first wife, Rebecca, for only 2 years before the war separated them. She had been a schoolteacher, gentle and educated, and her death had left him feeling responsible for failing to protect her. The guilt had driven him west, away from the memories and the life they had planned together. Elijah, in turn, learned that Mary's parents had been loving but poor, and that their death when she was 16 had thrust her into a world where she was seen as a burden rather than a person. The series of relatives who had reluctantly taken her and had made it clear that her presence was temporary and unwelcome, leaving her with a deep fear of abandonment and a desperate need to prove her worth. As December gave way to January, their conversations grew more personal and more meaningful. They talked about their dreams, their fears, and their hopes for the future. Mary found herself sharing thoughts and feelings she had never expressed to anyone, and Elijah began to open up about the loneliness that had driven him to help her that day in town. "I saw something of myself in you," he admitted one snowy evening as they sat by the fire. "That look in your eyes when Morrison was threatening you. It was the same look I had when I came home from a war to find Rebecca gone, lost alone with nowhere to turn." "But you had your ranch," Mary pointed out. "You had something to build on." "I had land," Elijah corrected. "But land isn't the same as having a home. A home needs more than one person to make it real." The implication in his words made Mary's heart race, but she didn't dare assume too much. They had both been hurt before, and trust was something that had to be earned slowly. It was in February, during a particularly fierce blizzard that kept them housebound for nearly a week, that everything changed. Mary had been feeling unwell for several days, not seriously ill, but tired and slightly nauseous. She had attributed it to the close quarters and the stress of the weather, but on the third day of the storm, she fainted while preparing breakfast. Elijah found her on the kitchen floor and carried her to her room, his face tight with worry. As he helped her to bed, Mary was struck by the gentleness of his touch and the genuine concern in his eyes. "I'm fine," she protested weakly. "Just tired." "You're not fine," Elijah said firmly. "You've been working too hard, and you're not eating enough. I should have noticed." He insisted on bringing her meals and checking on her throughout the day, and Mary found herself touched by his care. But it was that evening, as the storm raged outside and she lay in her small room, feeling vulnerable and alone, that she realized the truth about her feelings. She was in love with Elijah Gray. The realization hit her like a physical blow. She had been so focused on being grateful for his kindness and proving herself worthy of his help that she hadn't recognized the deeper feelings that had been growing in her heart. But now, as she lay in the darkness listening to him moving around the house, she couldn't deny it anymore. She loved his quiet strength, his gentle humor, his unwavering integrity. She loved the way he treated her with respect and dignity, the way he listened to her thoughts and opinions as if they mattered. She loved the life they had built together, the rhythm of their days, the comfortable silences and meaningful conversations. But with that realization came fear. What if he didn't feel the same way? What if she was just a convenient housekeeper to him, someone to ease his loneliness without offering anything more? What if admitting her feelings would destroy the fragile stability she had found? The next morning, Mary felt well enough to resume her duties, but she found herself watching Elijah with new eyes. She noticed the way he looked at her when he thought she wasn't watching, the way his hand lingered when he passed her something, the way he seemed to find excuses to stay in the kitchen while she worked. It was Elijah who finally broke the tension between them. On a clear, cold morning in late February, he approached her as she was feeding the chickens, his expression serious and determined. "Mary," he said, "I need to talk to you. About us." Mary's heart began to race, but she kept her voice steady. "What about us?" "I know I hired you to keep house and help with the ranch," Elijah said. "But somewhere along the way, it became more than that. At least it did for me." Mary looked into his eyes and saw her own feelings reflected there, love, hope, and fear all mixed together. "For me too," she said softly. "I never thought I'd feel this way again," Elijah continued. "After Rebecca died, I thought that part of my life was over. But you brought something back to life in me that I thought was dead." "I feel the same way," Mary admitted. "I never thought I'd have a real home, or someone who cared about me. But this place, with you, it feels like home." Elijah stepped closer, his hand reaching up to touch her face with infinite gentleness. "I love you, Mary, not just for what you do, but for who you are. You're strong and kind and brave, and you make me want to be a better man." I love you too, Mary whispered, tears streaming down her face. I have for a long time, but I was afraid to say it. I was afraid too, Elijah admitted. Afraid of losing someone I cared about again. But I realized that being afraid of love is no way to live. When he kissed her, it was with a tenderness that spoke of promises and possibilities, of a future built on mutual respect and genuine affection. Mary had never been kissed before, but she knew instinctively that this was what love was supposed to feel like. Not desperate or demanding, but gentle and sure. When they finally pulled apart, Elijah took her hands in his. "Mary Collins," he said formally, "would you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" Mary's heart soared. "Yes," she said without hesitation. "Yes, I will." The wedding took place in early May, when the wildflowers were blooming across the hills and the air was warm with the promise of spring. They were married by the circuit preacher in the parlor of the ranch house, with Tom and Sarah Thompson and their children as witnesses. It was a simple ceremony, but Mary had never felt more beautiful or more loved. As they stood before the preacher, Mary thought about the journey that had brought her to this moment. Less than a year ago, she had been a desperate woman with no future, nearly sold for a bottle of whiskey to a man who saw her as nothing more than a commodity. Now she was becoming the wife of a man who loved her for herself, who had given her not just a home, but a place to belong. Do you, Mary Collins, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, for better or worse, till death do you part? "I do," Mary said, her voice clear and strong. "Do you, Elijah Gray, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, for better or worse, till death do you part?" "I do," Elijah replied, his eyes never leaving Mary's face. "Then, by the power vested in me, I now pronounce you husband and wife. You may kiss the bride." As Elijah kissed her, Mary felt the last of her fears and insecurities fall away. She was no longer Mary Collins, the unwanted orphan with no prospects. She was Mary Gray, beloved wife and partner, with a future full of possibilities. That evening, as they sat on the front porch watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Mary reflected on the strange twists of fate that had brought them together. "Do you ever think about that day in town?" she asked Elijah. "When Jake Morrison tried to buy me?" "Sometimes," Elijah admitted. "I think about how different things might have been if I hadn't been there, or if I hadn't spoken up." "I think about it too," Mary said, "but not with regret. If that hadn't happened, we might never have found each other. Sometimes the worst moments in our lives lead us to the best ones." Elijah took her hand and squeezed it gently. "I used to think that losing Rebecca was the end of my story. But it wasn't an ending, it was just a chapter. And now we're starting a new one together. What do you think this new chapter will bring?" Mary asked. "I don't know," Elijah said honestly. "But I know we'll face it together. And that makes all the difference." As they sat there in the gathering dusk, Mary felt a deep sense of peace settle over her. She had found what she had been searching for all her life. Not just a place to live, but a place to belong. Not just someone to care for her, but someone to love and be loved by in return. The life that stretched ahead of them wouldn't be easy. Ranch life was hard work, and they would face challenges and setbacks like any couple. But they would face them together, with the strength that comes from genuine love and mutual respect. Mary Gray, she still marveled at the sound of her new name, had found her home at last, and as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, she knew that this was just the beginning of their story together. In the distance, a coyote howled its lonely song to the moon, but Mary felt no loneliness now. She had found her place in the world, and it was here, beside the man who had seen her worth when she couldn't see it herself. In the home they had built together with love, patience, and hope. The woman who had once been worth nothing more than a bottle of whiskey to a desperate drunk had found something infinitely more precious. A love that would last a lifetime, and a future full of promise. If you like this story, leave your opinion in the comments and, of course, leave a like and subscribe. Turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any videos. Big hug and see you soon.